Today, I want to talk about the idea of punching the cap when it comes to mead making. We've taken this term from the wine world, where they obviously use a lot of grapes. Duh. With fruit matter, or fruit in general, you want to try and make sure that your fruit is, I don't want to say constantly submerged, but the more submerged it is in your brew, the more tannin, the more flavor, the more it's going to do in the fermentation. So the idea of punching the cap is really only useful for fruit meads or anything that really uses a fair amount of matter or mass. I guess if you had a bunch of spices or something, you could punch the cap with those. But for my example today, I have a blueberry mead right here. Now, I want to try and help you out with some misconceptions and some things that people worry about. This was started 2 days ago. It has blueberries in it, and I'm about to open it. Many people get very afraid to open their fermenter whenever it's first going, because you see that online sometimes, like, don't open your fermenter after it gets going. It's not necessarily true. The worry there is that you might get a bad bacteria that falls into the brew and messes with things, but if you're using conventional or standard wine yeast, or really even ale yeast, more than likely you're gonna have some protection from wild yeast. So I haven't had a wild yeast take over something that's had a wine yeast in it because they're stronger, they're healthier, generally they kickstart faster. So when I open my fermenter, I'm not too worried about a wild yeast falling in or some sort of bacteria, generally speaking. I do have to worry about making sure that all the utensils I use when I'm stirring things up are sanitized. So this is Star San water. So let's look at our blueberries. These blueberries, of course, have floated to the top. I have tried to mash them as best as I can. Now, the punching the cap sort of idea is literally the process of taking these blueberries, which are just floating up top right now, and pushing them down some. We do this because we want to try and get more of that fruit flavor in the brew. We don't want the blueberries to dry out or the fruit to dry out. So if they sat like this for weeks and weeks and weeks, there's a good chance that they could dry out. And there is still a chance that those wild yeast or some bacteria could grow on top of this if they're not submerged or stirred in often. I have had a few situations where a pellicle has formed, which is its own little bacteria. It's not necessarily the same as like a bad thing that's gonna kill your brew, but it definitely changes your fermentation. Well, all I'm gonna do, punching the cap, literally is just the process. I'm literally just gonna take my sanitized bottling wand and just mix this around. And all I'm doing is trying to get the fruit down. In the commercial scale, I've talked to many mead makers, they do this at the commercial scale, and it's a whole lot harder because you're thinking of hundreds of pounds of fruit, and they have these big paddle mashers that they have to push the fruit down. For us homebrew level people, stuff like this is real simple. You just stir it around. This is also gonna partially degas. You notice that I'm not like vigorously stirring, and that's to hopefully keep from adding too much oxygen later on. With this being 2 days old in fermentation, a little oxygen is not gonna hurt. If this was like later on, let's say a week old and I was doing this still, I'd wanna be real careful not to add oxygen. How long do you punch the cap for? I will generally do this for like the first 2 weeks, almost all the way through the primary fermentation. And as the days go by, I get less vigorous with my mixing. And that's of course to keep oxygen from being introduced. You do this all the time with fruit, especially if it's coming up to the top. So we've punched the cap of this fruit, this mead, and we're now going to put our lid back on, seal it back up, and we're gonna put it away. And then I'll do the same thing tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. If you need to, you could do multiple times a day, but more than likely you don't need to do that. So we've punched the cap here. I hope this has helped. Use this for your fruit meads to help hopefully get more fruit flavor, keep any possible bad bacteria from taking over. And I didn't mention this, but it also helps to get more tannin from the fruit if they're submerged, because there is tannin that can be found in some of these fruits, so you get more of that character. I hope this has helped. This has been how to punch the cap on a fruit mead and why we do this. If you'd like more information, of course, go down in the comments, ask me a question, and I hope to see you in a future video. Cheers. Because they're kind of stronger than wild yeast, so I haven't had